The Okimalatham have never stopped adapting. For time immemorial, our people have lived along the river, building homes from the earth and drawing life from the water. Through all of it, we learned to adapt, to change, to evolve. And what I want to talk about today are 4 recent periods that changed life in our community. The late 1800s, when education, housing, and farming were all transformed. The mid-1900s, when war and relocation reshaped family and community. The late 1900s, when we began to take back power. And the 21st century, when we found economic and political power again in the rebuilding of our community. Each of these periods brought new challenges, and each time our people found ways to endure and to stay connected. Because even as the world around us shifted, we carried our values forward: respect, community, and connection. The first wave: education, faith, and the reshaping of daily life. Now, long before the Americans, Mexicans, or the Spanish arrived, life was not easy for the O'odham. The last 500 years or so were filled with fighting with the Apache and other traditional enemies. Then, more recently, the Spanish pressed from the south, the Americans moved from the west and the north, and we've had to adapt to a lot of changes. There's a lot of history before contact with these groups, but I want to focus on the profound changes that came in the late 1800s, when education, housing, farming, and faith all began to change at once. Now, during this time, the water that had sustained our people for generations was being stolen. Upstream canals, dams, and wells reduced the Gila to a trickle. Still, our people adapted. Villages moved, fields were planted with different crops, and families left the community to find work where they could. Now, without water, people became desperate. Crops failed and hunger spread. By 1880, the government had to distribute rations to families who could no longer grow their own food. Churches began to appear across the community, first through missionaries like Charles Cook, and later through Catholic and Protestant missions as well. These churches were part of a network of aid, and our people began to reorient social gatherings and connection around them. Now, never before had the Okimalatham had a church system influencing daily life. But under Cook's guidance, the community saw a number of churches take root, and our people rapidly converted. They prayed and sang hymns in O'odham, and many of the church images were adapted with O'odham figures and symbols as well. Charles H. Cook also opened the first formal school at Saskatoon. In a tiny one-room school, he taught 30 children to begin with. Reading, math, and English, that was the beginning of classroom education for our community. Before then, learning took place at home. Parents, grandparents, and others in the village taught and prepared children for life. But with the arrival of the Menegan, our ancestors understood they would need new skills to adapt and survive. Now, by the 1880s, we built the Pima boarding school at Saskatoon, and it burned in 1888, and it was rebuilt again in the same place. Many of our students also left the community to attend nearby schools like Phoenix Indian School or the Tucson's Escuela, and some even went as far away as Hampton, Santa Fe, or Carlisle. Some of them were sent by their parents, and some of them were sent away to help move along their adoption of Western practices, cutting their hair short, attending church, and speaking English. But as our classrooms changed, so did our homes. For generations, families built brush and mud houses like the Oraski in close villages. Then, in 1886, Chief Antonio Lazul built the first adobe house in our community. Soon after, the U.S. agent here offered a wagon and harness to any family who built one too, and within a few years, villages were full of adobe homes. Building an adobe house became a mark of progress, of moving forward. And by the early 1900s, these changes had remade daily life. We had new schools, new homes, new churches, but less water and new challenges we were facing. That first wave of change opened the door for what came next. The second wave: war, relocation, and reconnection. The second great wave of change began around the time of World War I. The early 1900s brought war, economic hardship, and more federal control, but also opportunity and pride. When the First World War began, young O'odham men were sent to the trenches. Now, many know the name Matthew B. Wan, Matthew Rivers, a young O'odham who was the first killed in World War I from Arizona. But there were many of our people involved in the war. We didn't even have U.S. citizenship yet, but we fought for the same flag as everyone else did. And around that same time, as the war was ending in about 1917, allotment was finished dividing our lands into individual plots as well. It was meant to make us independent farmers, but instead allotment split apart villages and families. The parcels of land received were too small to compete with outside farmers, and our traditional village layouts were lost. In part to the grid system, we began to build our homes further and further apart. In the years after World War I, families tried to rebuild stability under the new federal systems, and by the 1930s, a new era of schools emerged, the day school era, with funding meant to keep our children at home with their families while they learned. For the first time in almost 50 years, children were once again expected to be raised and educated within the community. These schools tried to repair what the boarding schools had broken by keeping families together while teaching new skills. But many families would still send their children to local boarding schools outside the community. But then came another milestone. In 1934, the first high school was built here in the community, the Pima Central High School. This was one of the first high schools in the country as part of this new day school plan. And in 1939, the school had the first graduating class of Native American high school seniors in the entire nation. Folks who had lived and went to school in their own communities. Now, it was also during this same period that our first constitution under the Indian Reorganization Act, the IRA, gave the community a formally recognized government. This was a huge achievement for our early community leaders, and while it didn't end federal oversight, it gave our leaders new tools to govern and advocate for our people. When World War II began in 1942, hundreds of men and women from our community served. Some went overseas, others supported the war effort here in the United States. So many of our people went off to war that the high school was all but shut down. There were 0 students for the junior or senior classes, and once the war stopped, there was a difficult time getting people back into school. Post-World War II, the federal policy shifted yet again. New relocation programs for the 1950s and 60s encouraged our families to move out of the community for work. And many were urged, sometimes pressured, to move to cities like Los Angeles, Portland, or Chicago. For many families, this was the first time living away from the community they had grown up in. They were promised opportunity, but the reality was often loneliness and separation. Now, urban members still visited whenever they could. They taught their children where they came from, even when home was hundreds of miles away. Letters, phone calls, weekend trips kept people connected. And while some moved away, those at home were rebuilding, because the 1960s was also a time of reinvention. We founded the Gila River News, our first community-run newspaper, launched the Vataupuju plan to rebuild the economy, and redesigned our government through a major constitutional amendment to help better serve our people. The people involved in these projects were often the same veterans who had went through our local schools for education and went off and served in the military. Now, this generation helped to rebuild the structure of our community, laid the groundwork for our coming economic development and community growth in the 70s and 80s. The third wave, reclaiming control and rebuilding sovereignty. Now, in the 1970s, the new economic plan was creating amazing developments in education and throughout our government. The community began to take over what had once been managed by outside agencies, and tribal programs in education, housing, environmental protection, and health grew stronger each year. We were reclaiming control from the federal government once again. The 1970s and 80s became a period of institution building. The schools expanded, new facilities were built like the Arts and Crafts Center, the Lone Butte Development, and other industrial parks were created and started to generate income for the community. And these were years of steady progress, but challenges still remained. Water rights were unresolved, and there were farmers in the community who were facing tough markets that were importing crops from overseas and undercutting our sales. At the same time, outside development pushed ever closer to our boundaries. As we entered the 80s, we worked to connect our spread out homes with electricity, telephones, and new infrastructure, making it easier to reach one another and to communicate. But even in this period of progress, new challenges began to appear. The fourth wave: growth, sovereignty, and the challenge of connection. You see, by the 1990s, the community was rapidly expanding its control of government and economic systems. Gaming didn't start our move to reassert control, but the revenue it created from the adoption of the Gaming Compact in the 90s, it helped us to expand, invest in our people, and grow our government very quickly. These were decades of incredible growth. We built a government with reach and authority that our ancestors had been planning for almost 100 years. We gained resources, institutions, and the ability to shape our own future. In 2006, the long fight for water rights finally reached resolution. After generations of loss, our water, once stolen and diverted for more than a century, was recognized again as ours, and we finally began to get our water back. But as our government grew stronger, as our water returned, something else was changing. Technology connected us more than ever, but many people began to feel more alone. People met in person less often, and participation in social and district gatherings started to decline. Crime was rising, and disconnection was becoming more and more common. And these issues are not entirely new. They began generations ago, when allotment divided our villages and scattered our families across distant parcels of land, when boarding schools took our children from their homes, and when relocation drew many away in search of work. But each of these events separated our connection just a little further each time. And now, technology and modern life sped up the separation. Under the weight of busy lives and screens, we've started to become more isolated. And that's the challenge that this period will need to overcome. We've achieved the self-governance and growth that our ancestors fought to bring back for generations, but our community is more than just a strong government. We've survived every wave of change because we've stayed connected to each other, to our values, and to our land. And if we lose that connection, no system or technology will save it for us. And that's what today is about. When we gather here, to visit, to laugh, to share stories, we're doing the very thing that has kept our people strong through every generation. Each handshake, each conversation, each shared memory strengthens our community. Because true power has always come from the people, from families who keep our language and histories alive, from neighbors who check in and visit with each other, and those who take the time to show up at district meetings, events, celebrations. That is where sovereignty begins. Not in government, but in community. Our people, because change will always come, but if we keep showing up like you all are today, if we keep gathering, building, and taking care of one another, every new challenge will be something we can overcome. The Akim and Latham have changed many times, but we still remain the same at heart. As long as we remember who we are and keep our Hemdag alive, and how we live and care for one another, we'll never be lost.